Greetings, everyone. My name is Emmanuel, and I would like to welcome you to our program today. We are continuing with our series on rebuilding a new Africa through decentralization. And our topic today is the role of the church is to empower believers to become problem solvers, to empower believers to become social activists, to empower believers to become world changers. The role of the church is to empower believers to become nation builders, to empower believers to take the responsibility to solve socio-economic and political problems in our communities and nations. The role of the church is to empower believers who are sitting in the pews to become doctors, to become lawyers, to become engineers, to become IT specialists, to become professors, to become prime ministers, to become presidents. The role of the church is to empower believers mentally, to empower them spiritually, to empower them even physically, to inspire them to do the right things. The role of the church is to strengthen, to empower, to edify believers to become great, to take the responsibility to solve the problems in our communities and in our nations. You see, the government alone cannot solve all the problems in our communities and in our nations. That is why the church must contribute towards national development and economic prosperity in our nations. That is why the church must take the responsibility to empower Christians to solve some of the socio-economic and political problems in our communities and nations. Why? Because the government alone cannot solve all the problems in our communities. You see, the people who are sitting in our pews, they have great potentials to become great men and women of God. They have great potentials to become doctors, to become lawyers, to become engineers, to become IT specialists, to become professors, to become bankers, to become farmers, to become journalists, to become religious leaders, to become great men and women of God. That is why, as pastors, we must inspire believers to be great. You see, like I said in my last video, part of the money that comes in as tithes and offerings in our local churches must be kept aside as a scholarship fund to help train and equip believers in our local churches to acquire skills that they will later use to transform our communities and our nations. You see, the money that comes in through tithes and offerings is not just to benefit the pastors, it is also to benefit the orphans, the widows, the poor, the strangers in our local churches and in our communities. That is why it is the responsibility of the church to empower, students in our local churches who are very intelligent, but they come from poor homes. So the church must take that responsibility, especially mega churches that have the resources, the financial resources to send some of these children to schools to go and study, to become lawyers, to become doctors, to become IT specialists, to become, pharmacists, to become journalists, to become military personnel, to become, prime ministers, to become presidents in our countries. It is not just the job of the government to solve all the social problems, all the economic problems, all the political problems in our countries. The church must contribute towards, solving these problems. Remember, the church is the voice of the voiceless. The church is the defender of the defenseless. The church is like, the father to the fatherless. The church is like the feet, to the lame. The church is like the eyes to the blind. The church has, the responsibility to deliver, people from oppression. The church must stand up and speak truth to power. The church is the last defense in our communities and nations. The church is the conscience of our nations. The church is the pillar and ground of truth in our communities and in our nations. So it is incumbent upon the church to take the responsibility to empower believers to be problem solvers, to empower believers to be world changers, to empower believers to be deliverers, to empower believers to be reformers, to empower believers to be transformational leaders, to empower believers to solve the socio-economic and political problems in our communities and in our nations. That is the responsibility of the church. It's not just the government alone solving these complex and difficult questions in our communities and in our nations. Just think about Joseph in Egypt. Joseph in Egypt, he was the one who God helped, to solve the famine problem in Egypt. Remember Moses? He was the one that God used to deliver the children of Israel in captivity in Egypt. Remember Nehemiah? He was the one that God used, to send the children of Israel back to their land, to build a wall and subsequently build a temple. Remember Daniel? He was the one that God used, to have powerful end time dreams concerning the kingdom gospel. Remember Esther? She was the one that Esther and Mordecai, they were the ones that God used to preserve the Jewish people when Haman and his colleagues were about to exterminate them and destroy them. But God used Esther and Mordecai to preserve the Jewish people. That is why even in our days, the Bible says that we are living in dangerous times. We are living in perilous times. There's a lot of injustice against the church. There's a lot of injustice against the poor, the orphans, the needy. There's a lot of marginalization going on, against minority groups. There is a lot of suffering, discrimination going on against women, against, other groups of people, tribalism, corruption, kidnappings, violence, all these crimes, social ills in our communities and in our nations. It is the responsibility of the church to empower believers to take the responsibility to solve some of these problems. You see, the people in our churches, they have the potentials to become great, to become problem solvers, but they need the inspiration from our local churches. Some of the people in our local churches, they have the potentials to become doctors. They have the potentials to become engineers. That is why the church, must take the responsibility to empower believers. The church should also build schools to train, people to acquire skills. The church should also build factories, especially the mega churches that have the resources. They should, open hospitals to solve and to heal and to cure some of the diseases that are rampant in our communities and in our nations. You see, the church should also open industries, maybe mechanic shops, where young boys and girls can go in and learn, to become mechanics. They should open, tailoring workshops where women can go in to learn how to sew. These are things that churches can do in our communities and in our nations. And all of these things will contribute towards the development of our nations. All of these things will contribute towards the prosperity of our nations. We must not, leave the challenges and the problems, only to the government to solve. The government alone cannot solve all the social, economic, and political problems. The church must contribute towards the transformation of our communities and our nations. We are talking today about the role of the church to empower believers to be, problem solvers, to be world changers, to be transformational leaders, to be lawyers, doctors. Like today, some people, have been kicked out of maybe social media platforms for posting certain things that some people do not like. It is time for the church to inspire Christians, to start creating their own platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and other such platforms that will attract a lot of people and that, Christians can use to disseminate the kingdom message, which is a message that, brings peace, a message that brings, prosperity, a message that helps, to solve social, economic, and political problems. You see, we are also living in dangerous times when churches are being attacked. So it is the role of the church to raise, to train, to empower, to inspire believers to become lawyers so that they will be able to defend the interests of, our local churches. It is time also, for our churches to empower believers to become politicians, to empower believers to go into the corridors of power so that they can make moral laws. They can come up with policies that encourage economic growth and national prosperity. It is time for the church to empower believers, to become problem solvers in our communities and in our nations. We must not leave these functions only to the government. Most of our governments are even corrupt and incompetent, so they cannot, solve some of these problems. That is why the church must take the responsibility to empower believers to be problem solvers in our communities and in our nations. The role of the church is to empower believers to be transformational leaders. The role of the church is to empower believers to be world changers. The role of the church is to empower believers to be history makers. The role of the church is to inspire believers to be doctors, lawyers, engineers. Many of the people in our pews, they have the potential to be great. They have the potential to succeed, but some of them don't receive the encouragement. Some of them don't receive, the empowerment from their local churches. It is time for our churches to begin to empower believers in our pews to take responsibility, to solve the problems in our communities and in our nations. The church must empower believers mentally. The church must empower believers, even physically. The church must empower believers spiritually as well. It's not just the spiritual aspect that will bring transformation and economic prosperity in our nations. The church must take the responsibility, to inspire believers to be empowered intellectually, to have specialized skills so that they will be able to contribute towards, solving some of the socio-economic and political problems in our nations. It is time for the church to empower believers to get into politics, so that they can implement policies that will bring national transformation and development in our nations. Thank you so much for watching this video. We are going to continue next time. Until then, bye-bye.